Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good morning, listeners. It is a lovely day here in suburban Chicago. It's the crickets are chirping and the temperature is moderate. Still warm enough that it feels like summer, but getting cooler every day. I come to you today thinking a little bit about how do you understand how I understand my collection. I know it's a weird thing to say, but there it is. I have built my collection and I categorize the games in my collection in a variety of ways. I categorize them by player count. I categorize them by weight. And that weight is generally my view of their weight rather than, I don't use Board Game Geek's ratings or anything to decide weight. But I also have a couple other categories. I have a category of games I call filler. I have games that are really primarily for two players. I have a category of games I call novelty games. And I thought today I would talk about a couple categories or a couple novelty games that I have and what do I mean by that. So novelty games in my collection are games that I don't expect to play very often, and I keep them because they're a novelty, because they're an interesting thing to have in my collection. They're almost a conversation piece. When you come into my basement and you look at the place we keep our games, when you see these games, you're like, oh, that's odd, that's weird, or I can't believe you have that. That's the sort of game that we're talking about. So I want to talk about a couple different games in my collection and in the novelty section of my collection and why they're there. So I'm going to start with The Office. So I have, I think, 4 games themed around The Office. I have The Office, The Clue. I have The Office Don't Get Downsized game. I have The Office DVD trivia game. And I think I have one more Office themed game. And the idea of this is that I am working on an academic project about the TV show The Office, and having these at my disposal gives me more things to write or think about. That's it. Most of the time I'm picking these games up in used stores or at thrift stores for moderate or incredibly low prices. And so basically these are something I might write about or be interested in writing about. So some of the games that I have in my collection, I have for the purpose of potential study later. Another example is I recently picked up a 2006 edition called the Nostalgia Edition of the Mystery Date game, because it uses all the original graphics and everything. And so having that handy, I may want to be able to look at that sometime. And again, I got it at Goodwill for $3 or something. I also put into this category, so the next category of game I would talk about, which the Mystery Date game leads into, are older games that are amusing to have in my collection for other purposes. Like, for instance, I have this game called Cattleman. And Cattleman I picked up, again, at a thrift store, in part because the cover art looks like a still shot from a late 70s, early 80s soap opera. It looks like some of the extras from Dallas got hired to come and do a photo shoot about Cattleman. And the game itself seems pretty pedestrian. I haven't played it yet. But it's the art and style of the game that I'm interested in. I'm intrigued by the idea of thinking about and looking at old games that have been around a while, and sort of seeing how do they work and what are they like, and particularly games that were not aimed at children but have some element to this. In that regard, another game we have in our collection is The Tower of the Wizard King, which I swiped from my in-laws. I mean, they had it in the back of a closet. They weren't using it. I asked if I could take it. But this game has a really interesting gimmick where you play a warrior, and each warrior has different kinds of stats that allow them to do well in different parts of the kingdom. But one of the things you can do is you can travel to the Tower of the Wizard King, and you put your figure in, and then you twist a gizmo, which doesn't actually work properly, so we have to kind of fake it. But you twist a gizmo, and then you are transformed into a different character. And the way that works is just that there are characters in the thing, and when you twist the gizmo, it spits out another character, and you don't know whether it's going to go once or twice, so you don't know which other character is going to come out. So it's a silly gimmick, but it's fun nonetheless. And I mean, it's a pretty dumb game overall, but compared to a lot of the games of its era, at least it's interesting. And the box art has this sort of side of the van 1980s feel, a fantasy feel to it, and it's something I enjoy having in our collection. So I have a number of games that are in my collection for that kind of generic old board game approach. The third kind of novelty game that I have in my collection that I wanted to mention is classic games. And these aren't really novelties in the same way that the other ones are, because I'm not keeping them for nostalgia. I'm not keeping them for connection to a project I'm doing, but instead I'm keeping them as sort of historical record of the kind of game you should have, or the sort of mass market games that people have, right? And so some of these are actually games that I enjoy playing. Battleship is fun. I think there's something to be said for the delight of trying to trick people and figuring out where their ships are and so on. I don't have a copy of Stratego, actually. I'm kind of kicking myself. I saw one at Goodwill a couple weeks ago. I did not pick it up, but I probably should have, because that's one that actually is a fun game, and I would like to have a copy of that in our library. But then there's also stuff like Risk and Clue and Monopoly, games that we don't really play much, but we should have in our collection. My mom has a copy of The Game of Life that I've been meaning to pick up when I'm at her house, and I probably will do, because it's old-timey art and old prices, and that's interesting. The copy of Clue that my mom has too is the same way. Whereas like the Clue that I have is, like I said, I have the Office Clue. I have the Office Clue. Then I also have the Simpsons Clue. And the Simpsons Clue is a straight up port. There's no new rules. I haven't looked at the Office Clue to see whether that one has different rules or not. But either way, Clue itself has an interesting game with like the roll and move element that makes it less interesting. But we do have that. I also have an old game that I really liked when I was young called Solar Quest, which is basically Monopoly in space. But if you're playing with the fuel rules, it's pretty interesting, because you have, every time you move, you're burning fuel, and you have to build fuel stations to refuel, or stop at fuel stations and buy fuel. And if you don't, then you could end up getting stranded until someone comes and gives you fuel, which I think is an interesting element. And then I mentioned the other games sort of the genre. We also have like Mancala and Chinese checkers and a number of games that are just sort of standard hobby board games, or standard mass market board games that most people have. I do have those. I keep them in our novelty collection because I almost keep them just out of a sense of duty more than because I enjoy them. So that's those are mass market games. The fourth category I want to talk about are games about media properties, adaptations that I have, mostly because I'm interested in the adaptation more than I'm interested in the game. And I guess you could kind of lump this in the same category as The Office, but it's more, I don't think I'll ever do anything with these as games to write about or study academically, but they're fun to have. And the two that come to mind in particular are, I have a game based on Columbo, and I have a game based on Murder, She Wrote. The Murder, She Wrote game is from obviously the late 80s, and it has a hilariously bad picture of Angela Lansbury on the cover, which makes for amusement every time we bring it out. And then the Columbo game, I don't think whatever company made it, they got the license for the Columbo character, but they apparently weren't willing to pay for Peter Falk's likeness rights. So the Columbo on the box is not Peter Falk, but instead is Columbo facing away. He's got his hand up and he's doing the thing he does. One more thing, but it's not Columbo's face, because I presume they didn't want to pay that sweet asking price that Peter Falk was asking for. And I do have some games that are in my general board gaming collection that came to be in our collection for this very purpose, right? We have the Goonies adventure card game. We have the Back to the Future adventure card game. I feel like there's one more, but it's not coming to me right now. So we have a number of games that are in our collection because we like the source material, even if the game itself isn't that great. And then the last category of novelty game are games around a theme that I enjoy. And I've mentioned this a number of times on the podcast, so sorry for repeating myself, but games focused on the wreck of the Titanic. So as you know, I am what some people might call a Titanic enthusiast. I had one friend who referred to it as being a Titaniac. Essentially, the idea is I am fascinated with the construction, sailing, and destruction of the world's most famous shipwreck, the Titanic, which was, of course, part of the White Star Line and sank in 1912. So, anytime I've found a board game about Titanic, I've purchased it. Now, there are a couple board games that exist that I don't have, that I know exist. There's one called Titanic, which is, I think, German. I haven't been able to get a copy of that. And there's one called Collapsible D, which is Titanic themed. It was made in Italy, but printed in English. And I've yet to be able to find a copy of that I can get. I suppose if I were willing to pay a drastic amount of money, I could probably get a hold of it. I could. The other Titanic game that I have not gotten is actually the Leonardo DiCaprio, the one with Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet on the cover. I have not picked up that Titanic game. I only saw it once at Target, and it was full price, and the reviews were just so terrible, I couldn't bring myself to buy it for full price. And I haven't seen it again since. I think if I encountered it today at full price, I probably would buy it, because I guess I just thought it would be more widely available than it is. But yeah, so that disappeared pretty quickly. Oddly enough, I know Daryl Andrews was involved in the design of that game, so that's kind of interesting. Daryl Andrews is the designer of Sagrada, along with Adrian Adamescu, I think. But I do have several other Titanic games. I have the now being reprinted game, SOS Titanic from Bruno Faiduti. So that one's fun. That's the only hobby Titanic game I have. And then I have three more novelty Titanic games. I have Titanic, which was released in the mid-90s and I think was meant to capitalize on the James Cameron movie. It is not at all it does not use the characters from the movie, and it's about trying to get off the ship. I think it's trying to get off the ship with the most money, which is grim. But yeah, the idea is to get off the ship, get to the lifeboats and get off the ship. There's a mid-80s one, a board game based on, I think, the movie, which is based on a Clive Cussler novel called Raise the Titanic. I actually have a copy of this novel as well, which I have not read, but in Raise the Titanic, you are part of a group that has found the wrecked Titanic and you are trying to raise it to the surface for some reason. This was before the Titanic was actually discovered, and so it was not yet clearly known that the Titanic had broken in two and essentially disintegrated. Big chunks of it had disintegrated during the sinking to the floor. The movie and the game and the book presume the Titanic to be in one piece, oddly. And then finally, I have the 1970s classic, The Sinking of the Titanic, which I guess was rethemed shipwreck or something because it was deemed to be in poor taste. But in the sinking of the Titanic, your goal is to escape from the ship, and you do so by running around and gathering people and getting in a lifeboat. And then there's like a second half of the game where you float around and try to get to an island, which is a weird non-historical choice. But yeah, so I have a bunch of Titanic games. That's generally the categories that inform what makes me decide to add a game to my novelty collection. I'd be interested to hear, do you have some games that you would put in that category? Games that you have more for the collection than for playing? And how do you decide which games to add that way and why? Head over to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and let me know. I'd be happy to hear your thoughts on that issue. You could reach out to me directly, brendan@rattleboxgames.com, or on Board Game Geek, my username is wombat929. Feel free to send me a direct message that way. I'm on the asynchronous gaming platforms Board Game Arena, Boitaju, and Yukata.de. In all three places, wombat929. I'd enjoy getting to know you or playing an asynchronous game with you there. Thanks for joining me on my walk today. I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.